Noriko walked 40 miles of bad road to a rancher who'd offer marriage instead of work. She was Japanese, lone, abandoned at a railhead by the labor broker who'd promised her a post, carrying nothing but a lacquered box her grandmother had filled in Kyoto. The widower, 2 winters a ghost on a dying ranch, told her he didn't need a servant, he needed a wife, and she answered with terms of her own. The bargain that started at his gate became a marriage not through any declaration, but through a quiet room where she opened that box. A storm that nearly took him, and a single line he spoke to the man who came to claim her. Stay until the end to see how a paper marriage became a real one, and if it moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Late October, and the wind had been working the valley for 3 days straight, carrying dust that stuck to everything and turned the light the color of old brass. Noriko stood at the fence of the Ryder place with a lacquered box cradled against her ribs and watched the house the way a woman watches a fire she isn't sure she should walk toward. She'd been standing there long enough for the rancher to notice and long enough for him to do nothing about it, which told her more than any greeting would have. She was small-framed, thin in a way that spoke of weeks of bad meals rather than years of delicacy. Her jet-black hair pulled back and pinned in a knot at the back of her head the way her grandmother had taught her in Kyoto. Her face was all sharp angles, high cheekbones, a narrow jaw, and eyes so dark they looked black in the shadow of the doorframe. She wore a plain kimono beneath a dust-coated trail coat that had been made for a larger person, and the hem of it was stiff with road dirt. She did not call out, did not wave, only waited. Zane Ryder stood on the porch with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand and studied her the way he studied stock that had wandered up to a fence. He'd been on this ranch 31 years, and he'd learned to read a creature by how it carried itself at the gate. This one carried itself like it owned something, even with nothing in its hands. He set the cup on the rail and walked down. The pump by the trough had been clattering for a week, and it clattered now behind him like a second heartbeat the ranch couldn't quiet. He stopped at the fence with the rail between them and didn't speak first, a habit he'd picked up about the time his wife stopped breathing. "I'm looking for work." Her English was careful, each word set down like a stone in a creek crossing, placed so it wouldn't roll. "I can cook, I can clean, I can tend stock. I can do all 3. He looked at the box. She didn't move it. "Where'd you come from?" "The railhead at Cottonwood, 3 days back." That was 40 miles of bad road by the cutoff, and most of it without water. He'd ridden it once in summer and wouldn't do it again. He looked at her boots, which were not made for 40 miles of anything, and at her hands, which were clean and steady, and had no business being either after a walk like that. "Who sent you?" "No one sent me." She said it flat, without pride and without apology, the way a person states the temperature. "The man who brought me from San Francisco was paid to bring me to a housekeeping post in Cheyenne. He left me at Cottonwood with the wagon, and the other passengers still on it. I walked. Inside the lacquered box, if he'd known to listen for it, was the quiet rattle of glass vials wrapped in cloth, and a set of needles so fine they made no sound at all." She did not tell him this, or about the woman in Kyoto who had put them in her hands when she was 9, or about the 7 years after that, or about the reason she had crossed an ocean with them in the first place. The box would keep its own counsel until she chose otherwise. She had learned long ago that a skill unannounced is a skill unharvested by people who don't deserve it. The lamp in the ranch house window behind him was lit even in the late morning, kerosene throwing an amber, flickering light against the glass because he hadn't bothered to blow it out from the night before. She noticed. A man who leaves a lamp burning in daylight has stopped caring what the dark costs him. She had come here because it was the nearest roof that wasn't a saloon, and because the woman at the general store 2 towns back had said the Ryder place hadn't seen a wife's hand in 2 winters and was starting to look it. She had not come here to be pitied. Pity was a debt, and she had spent the last 6 weeks paying other people's debts with her own labor, and she was done with it. The wind shifted and the dust came off the field in a low sheet, and she didn't flinch. Zane watched her not flinch, and something in him that had been asleep for a long time sat up a quarter inch. "All right," he said, and it wasn't agreement so much as a decision to stop standing at his own fence. "Come up to the house. I'll hear the rest of it inside." She came up to the house, and she did not thank him. He had not expected that. She told the rest of it at his kitchen table, with a cup of the same coffee he'd been drinking set in front of her and untouched. The labor broker's name was Harlan Moss. He'd collected her passage fee in San Francisco, signed a paper for a housekeeping post in Cheyenne, and put her on a wagon east with 5 other workers. At Cottonwood he'd sold the wagon's 2 spare horses, settled his tab at the hotel, and ridden out before dawn with the fees still in his pocket and the paper worthless in her bag. She had the paper, and she had kept it. Then she showed it to Zane across the table without comment, the way a person lays down a card they intend to keep. He read it. It was a lie signed in a hand that shook, and they both knew it. He pushed it back. "You walked 40 miles to find a man you'd never met and ask him for a job." "I walked 40 miles to find a roof," she corrected him without correcting him. "The job is what I offer for it." He poured himself more coffee and didn't offer her more, because she hadn't drunk the first, and he'd already learned she didn't take what she didn't want. The kitchen was clean in the way a room gets clean once, and then never again. The stove was blackened, and the pump handle at the sink was loose. On the wall behind her hung a small framed portrait of a woman with steady eyes and a face that had laughed once, and the dust on the frame was even, which meant no one had touched it in a long time. "Ruth," he said, and didn't explain. "She's been gone 2 winters." Noriko looked at the portrait long enough to acknowledge it, and then looked away. She understood portraits that stayed on walls. She had one she didn't carry anymore, and the reason she didn't carry it was the reason she was sitting here. "I'll be playing with you," he said, and she almost smiled because he had been playing with her from the fence and didn't know it. "I've had 3 hired hands in 18 months. First 2 quit inside a month. Third stole the tack and the buckboard horse and lit out for Denver. I'm done paying strangers to leave." "Then we have nothing to discuss." "I didn't say that." He set the cup down. "I said I'm done with hired hands." The pump clattered in the yard. The lamp flickered on the sill. She waited, because she had learned that the thing a man says second is usually the thing he means, and he hadn't said it yet. "I don't need a servant." He said it to the window, not to her, the way a man says something he's been turning over alone for a year. "I need a wife." The kitchen went quiet in a way that had weight. She did not move, did not soften. The words sat between them like a thing dropped on a table, and she looked at them the way she'd looked at the paper he'd pushed back. "This is not kindness," she said. "No, it isn't. This is a man who wants a woman's work and doesn't want to pay wages for it. That's part of it, and the rest," he finally looked at her. "The rest is I'm tired of eating alone in a house that's forgetting how to be one, and I'm too old to pretend a hired girl fixes that." She understood then that the offer was not a favor. It was a man describing the shape of the hole in his life and asking her to stand in it. She had been asked to stand in holes before. The difference was that this one was honest about what it was. "A wife," she said. "In name only." "In name only," he said. "I need a separate room. I've got 2. I earn my place by work. I do not take a wage, and I do not take a gift I have not earned. When I have earned my keep, if I choose to leave you, let me go." He considered it the way he considered a fence line, walking it in his head before he built it. "And if I choose to let you go before that, then you tell me to my face, and I go not behind my back. That is the one term I will not bend." He almost laughed. It came out as a breath. "You've been on my porch 20 minutes, and you already know I don't do things behind backs." "I know you left the lamp burning in daylight," she said. "A man who hides things blows the lamp out." That landed. She watched it land, and she did not look away. He had expected fear, or gratitude, or the careful flattery of a woman who needed a roof. He had not expected to be read. "The judge rides through in 9 days," he said. "We'll do it in this kitchen with one witness and a paper, no church, no preacher, you keep your box, your name where it matters to you, and your room. We try it. If it doesn't take, you go with my blessing and a horse. That is acceptable." She drank the coffee. It was cold and bitter, and she drank all of it, because she had decided, and a decision made over cold coffee should be finished over cold coffee. He watched her drink it and understood, without being told, that the drinking was the yes. The judge came through on a Tuesday, 9 days late, smelling of road dust and the particular exhaustion of a man who'd married and sentenced more people than he could count that month. His name was Horner, and he'd known Zane's wife, which he said only with his eyes when he stepped into the kitchen and saw the portrait still on the wall. The witness was Pete Alvarez, the one ranch hand left, who'd ridden in from the line cabin that morning because Zane had sent word, and because Pete was the kind of man who showed up when he was asked and didn't ask why. He took his hat off in the kitchen and held it in both hands and looked at Noriko the way the whole territory would look at her for the next year. That was to say, he looked at the kimono and the knot of black hair and the box on the dresser and filed it under things. He didn't have a word for yet. The ceremony took 4 minutes. Horner read the words the law required, and they answered the way the law required, and neither of them added anything the law didn't ask for. Zane's voice didn't break, and Noriko's didn't soften, and the lamp on the sill threw its amber flicker across the wall the whole time because no one had thought to blow it out. Pete signed the paper, and Horner signed the paper, and then it was done, and the kitchen was exactly as quiet as it had been before, only now the quiet had a name. Horner left the same way he came, with a handshake for Zane, and a nod for Noriko that was almost a question. Pete stayed for the meal she'd made without being asked, which was rice she'd found in the back of the store shelf, and a jackrabbit Pete had brought in 2 days before, cooked with dried herbs from a pouch she'd tucked inside the box. Pete ate 2 helpings and didn't speak until the second one was gone. "Where'd you learn to cook like that?" "My grandmother. She said it the way she said most things, as the whole answer and the edge of a longer one." Pete looked at Zane. Zane was watching her the way he'd watched her at the fence, which was to say he was watching her the way a man watches weather he can't read yet. He'd eaten the same 2 helpings, and he hadn't said a word about the food, and that more than the paper was what Pete took home with him when he rode back to the line cabin that night. The back room was small and cold and had been a storeroom until that morning, when Zane had cleared it and nailed a hook into the wall and brought in the narrow bed from the bunkhouse. He'd put a rug down that smelled of cedar and a lamp on the dresser that he'd filled and lit before she came in, so the room would be warm and lit and not feel like what it was, which was a storeroom with a bed in it. She set the lacquered box on the dresser beside the lamp and did not open it. She took off the trail coat and hung it on the hook and stood a moment in the kimono in the amber light, and he stood in the doorway, and neither of them crossed the room toward the other. "Ruth's things are still in the front room," he said. "I haven't moved them. I know. I won't move them either. Not yet." He nodded, and the nod was the closest thing to gratitude either of them would manage that night. He pulled the door almost closed behind him, leaving it open an inch, the way a man leaves a door when he wants the other person to know he's not locking anything. She heard his boots cross the hall and the creak of his own door, and then the house settled into the particular silence of 2 people lying awake in separate rooms, listening to each other, not sleep. She opened the box in the dark, just enough to lay one hand on the needles inside, the way a woman touches a thing to remember she still has it. Then she closed it and slept, and outside the wind came up again, and the pump clattered, and the lamp in the front window burned on because no one in that house had learned yet to blow out a light that didn't need to be lit. The next morning Pete rode back to town to settle a bill, and came home a day early with the news that the Foss boy, the youngest hand at the spread north of them, had quit and lit out, and that the country was getting thin on men who'd stay. Zane heard it and said nothing, and Noriko heard him say nothing, and understood that the ranch had been dying for longer than 2 winters, and that the dying was the thing he hadn't been able to name at the gate. She started before dawn, and without telling him. The pump had been clattering because the leather cup in the cylinder had worn through, and the well was good, and the only thing wrong with the whole arrangement was a 40-cent part and a man who hadn't cared enough to ride to town for one. She rode to town herself on the buckboard, with Pete's horse under her, and the kimono tucked up under a trail coat, bought the cup from the general store, came home, and had the pump quiet by noon. When Zane came up from the south pasture, the pump was silent and the trough was full, and she was on the porch mending a bridle he'd forgotten was broken. He looked at the pump, then at the bridle, then at her. "You ride. I ride. Who taught you to ride like a man? In my country we do not call it riding like a man. We call it riding." She pulled the wax thread through and bit it off. "My grandmother kept horses. She said, 'A horse does not care what you are wearing.'" He didn't answer that. He went inside, and she heard him stand a long time at the front window without moving, and she understood that he was learning the way a man learns a new language, that quiet competence in a woman did not require his permission. She did not wear Western clothes, not that day, not any day that followed. The kimono beneath the trail coat, the hair in the knot, the small steady hands, and she worked in all of it as if the silk were canvas and the knot were a working braid. Pete watched her haul water and mend fence and split kindling in the kimono, and finally said, one evening, that he'd never seen a woman do a day's work dressed like she was going to temple. She looked at him and said that was because he'd never been to a temple, and Pete, who hadn't, laughed in spite of himself. The trip to town for supplies came once a fortnight, and she took it over the second week because she could read a bill and he couldn't be bothered to. The general store was run by a man named Pollard, who had a good memory for debts and a poor one for faces, and the first time she laid her list on his counter, he looked at the kimono and the knot and the face above it and said, loud enough for the 2 ranchers at the stove to hear, "The Chinese woman from the Ryder place." "I'm Japanese," she said, and that was all she said, and she laid the list down again and waited. Pollard looked at the list. He looked at her. He shrugged the shrug of a man who did not believe the difference mattered, and he filled the order. She paid from the fold of bills Zane had given her, counted the change herself, and left. The 2 ranchers at the stove watched her go, and said nothing, which was its own kind of weather. The next trip, Zane rode along. Pollard said it again, "The Chinese woman." Zane corrected him without raising his voice, and without turning around. "She's Japanese." Pollard looked at Zane. Zane looked at the bill. The store got quiet the way stores get quiet when a man with a reputation makes a small thing into a line, and Pollard, who knew where lines got drawn in that county, did not say it again. Noriko's hand had tightened on the box where it rested against her hip, and Zane saw it tighten, and he saw her loosen it again when Pollard moved on. He filed that under things he was learning about her, which was that her pride was a quiet animal, and it bit hardest when it was held on a leash. The first crack in the bargain came 3 weeks in, on a Thursday, when Pete took a bad fall in the corral and gashed his leg to the bone on a rusted stake. The nearest doctor was 40 miles and 2 days away, and Pete was on the ground, with the blood coming out of him in a rhythm that said he didn't have 2 days. Zane had his belt around the leg and his hand on the pressure, and his face the color of the dust, because he'd watched his wife bleed out 2 winters back, and his hands knew the shape of that fear, even when his mind was somewhere else. Noriko knelt beside him and set the lacquered box on the boards of the corral and opened it for the first time in front of them. Inside, in fitted grooves of red silk, lay a set of needles so fine they caught no light at all, a small bone probe, a roll of clean linen, and a row of glass vials wrapped in cloth. She worked the way she'd been taught to work, which was without announcement and without hurry, and she talked to Pete in a low voice that wasn't English and wasn't meant for him, a steady running sound that had the same effect on the injured man as a hand on a frightened horse. She closed the vessel that was bleeding, packed the wound with a paste she mixed from 2 of the vials, bound it, and laid 3 needles along the leg in places that looked wrong to Zane, and that Pete, who had stopped screaming sometime in the middle of it, said afterward felt like warmth going down into the bone. Pete slept, and Zane didn't. He stood in the doorway of the bunkhouse and watched her clean the needles in boiling water and lay them back in their grooves, and his face changed while he watched, in a way he didn't have a word for, and didn't try to find one for. He had expected a wife in name, but he had not expected that. She'd been watching him move for 2 weeks before she said anything about it. The way he favored his right side coming off a horse, the way he braced with one hand against the doorframe when he thought no one was looking, the short breath he took at the top of the porch steps, the one that wasn't about the steps. One evening after Pete had gone back to the line cabin, she set the box on the kitchen table and did not open it. She sat down across from where he was cleaning the rifle and waited until he looked up. "Your ribs," she said. "It's an old break. It's an old break that healed wrong because you wouldn't let anyone touch it after your wife died." She said it without heat, the way she said most things, as a fact laid on a table. "She made you promise to see a doctor. You didn't. Now the promise has turned into the pain." He set the rifle down without asking how she knew. He'd figured out by then that she read bodies the way he read weather, and that arguing with her about what she'd read was like arguing with the rain. "Sit," she said. "I don't need to." "Sit," he sat, and she opened the box. The lamp was amber on the wall, and the kitchen was warm, and the house was quiet, in the way a house gets quiet when the people in it have stopped pretending the rooms between them are walls. She worked on him the way she'd worked on Pete, only slower, and this time there was no sound but the kettle cooling on the stove and his breathing. It changed, somewhere in the middle of it, from the careful shallow kind of a man guarding a break to the long breath of a man who'd forgotten he was allowed one. When she was done, sat a moment with his eyes closed. Then he opened them and said her name, Noriko. It was just the name, not thanks, not a speech. The first time he'd used it in the 2 months she'd been under his roof, and he used it the way a man uses a word when he's finally decided it belongs to him. She didn't answer, and she didn't need to. She closed the box and ran one finger along the lacquer, the way she'd run it along the needles that first night, and she said one line about the woman who'd given it to her. "My grandmother used these in Kyoto before I was born. She gave them to me the year before I left. She didn't say more, didn't say why she'd left, or who she'd left behind, or what the box had cost her to carry across an ocean. The one line was the root of the whole tree, and she let him hear the root and imagine the rest, because the rest was hers, and would stay hers until she chose otherwise. That night, for the first time since she'd come to the ranch, the door between the 2 rooms stayed open more than an inch. He left his open and she left hers. The hallway between them held nothing but lamplight and the sound of 2 people breathing honestly for the first time in years. For the first time since the funeral, something in the Ryder house came unlatched that wasn't a door. He came up the drive on a Sunday afternoon, 2 riders, the one in front, heavy in the saddle and wearing a city coat that didn't match the country, the one behind younger and carrying his revolver where a man carries one when he wants it noticed. Noriko saw them from the kitchen window, and her hand went to the box on the shelf before she knew it had moved, and then she made herself take the hand away and set it flat on the counter. She knew the one in front, and she'd know him in any country and in any coat. Harlan Moss dismounted at the fence and didn't tie his horse, which meant he expected to be leaving again soon and wanted it to look that way. He walked up to the porch with the younger man a step behind, and he knocked on the door frame the way a man knocks who believes the door is already his. Zane opened it. He'd been cleaning tack in the barn, and he had a bridle in one hand, and he stood in the doorway and filled it the way he'd always filled a doorway, which was enough that the man on the other side had to decide whether to step back. "I'm looking for the Japanese woman married here," Moss said. He had a paper in his hand, and he held it up the way Pollard held a bill, like it was the beginning and end of the conversation. She owes my employer a passage debt. I'm here to collect it and the goods it covers. What goods? Moss smiled the small smile of a man who counts people as freight. The box she's carrying and the tools, they were part of the transport contract, and she signed for them in San Francisco. Behind Zane in the kitchen, Noriko picked up the box and walked out onto the porch. She didn't go around him. She went through the door beside him and stood at his shoulder with the box in her arms, and her face the kind of calm that only comes from having already accepted the worst possible outcome. Moss saw her, and his smile thinned. You walked a long way from Cottonwood, Mrs. Ryder. I walked the distance you left me to walk. She didn't raise her voice, and she never raised it. I paid my passage in San Francisco in cash before I boarded your wagon. I have the receipt. She set the box on the porch rail and took a folded paper from inside the trail coat and opened it with the care of a woman who has kept a thing dry through 40 miles of rain and dust. She laid it on the rail beside the box. The paper was stamped and dated and signed in a hand that was not hers, and it said, in the plain English of a notary in San Francisco, that one Noriko Tanaka had paid her passage in full to one Harlan Moss. Moss looked at the paper. His face did the slow arithmetic of a man who has been caught in his own lie and is calculating how much of it he can still spend. That paper's no good out here. It's good in Cheyenne, Zane said. It's good in front of Judge Horner, who rode through here last month and signed my marriage paper in the same kitchen you're standing at the door of. So let's talk about what's good. Moss looked at Zane. Zane looked back. The younger man's hand had drifted to the revolver. Not fast, just drifted, the way a hand drifts when a situation stops going, the way the rider was told it would. Noriko shifted her weight. Long-wrapped bundle that had been leaning in the corner of her room since the first week, the one Zane had never asked about, was in her left hand now, and as she shifted, the cloth wrapping fell open an inch at the top and showed the polished handle of a blade. She didn't draw it, and she didn't need to. She stood the way her grandmother had taught her to stand with a weapon, which was as if the weapon were a part of her arm she happened not to be using yet. The younger man's hand went back to the pommel. Moss did the arithmetic again, and this time the answer was the same from every direction. This isn't finished. It is, Zane said, unless you want to come back with a sheriff and have him read 2 papers instead of 1. Then it'll be finished in front of him. Moss took his paper back and his smile with it, and the two of them rode out the way they'd come, and Noriko watched them until they were over the rise before she let her shoulders drop the 1/4 inch they'd been holding. Zane looked at the bundle in her hand. He looked at her. That's a naginata. It was my grandmother's. In my country, a woman of our house learned it before she learned the needles. He didn't ask why she'd kept it wrapped in the corner for 2 months without a word. He understood why. A skill unannounced is a skill unharvested by people who don't deserve it, and a weapon shown too soon is a weapon that gets taken away. That's my wife, he said, and this time he said it to her and not to Moss, and it wasn't a claim made for a stranger's benefit. It was a fact he was telling her he'd finally learned. The storm comes in on a Wednesday, and it doesn't ask. 3 days of it, the kind that takes fences and stock and roofs and doesn't give any of it back. The ranch that's been dying for 2 winters takes the hit that should finish it. Noriko and Zane stop being husband and wife on paper somewhere in the middle of the first night and start being 2 people trying to keep a piece of ground alive. The creek bottoms flood by the second morning. The south fence goes, and 3 steers get caught in the backwater of the low crossing, and Pete's off at the line cabin on the far side of the rise, and there's no reaching him. Zane saddles the bay in the rain, and Noriko saddles the dun without being asked, and they ride down into the creek bottom together because there's no one else and no time to discuss it. The water is brown and fast and up to the bay's belly, and the 3 steers are in the willows on the far side, 2 of them standing and one of them down against a fallen cottonwood with the current trying to roll it. Zane rides in for the down one because that's the kind of man he is, the kind who goes after the one that's lost even when the two standing ones are the smart money. He gets a rope on it, and the rope catches, and the current catches worse, and the bay goes sideways, and the cottonwood shifts, and Zane goes under. He comes up once, against the trunk, pinned at the hip, the bay fighting free upstream. He gets one breath, and the water takes the next one. He's thinking, in the clear, cold way a man thinks when the worst has stopped being a possibility, that this is how Ruth went, only slower and in a bed, and that he's about to find out whether she was right about the thing she said at the end. Noriko doesn't hesitate, doesn't think about the paper, or the terms, or the room down the hall. She kicks the dun into the water, and rides straight at the cottonwood, and the dun is a better horse than the bay in the bad water, because he's smaller, and he knows where to put his feet. She gets the rope on Zane on the first throw, the way her grandmother taught her to put a rope on a thing that was drowning, and she puts the dun's weight against the current, and she holds the cottonwood shifts. The current lets go of him the way a dog lets go of a bone when a bigger dog pulls. She hauls him across the saddle in front of her, and the dun carries them both out of the creek and up the bank, and the two steers still standing follow the dun because that's what cattle do in flood water. They follow the thing that's moving the right way. He's hurt, not drowning anymore, but hurt bad at the hip and the ribs where the trunk had him, and the cold has done something to the breath she'd fixed in the kitchen 2 weeks ago. She gets him to the barn because the barn is closer than the house and the house is dark, and she gets him onto the straw and gets the lamp lit and gets the box open. The amber light comes up on the walls the way it always does, flickering, not steady, because the oil in the lamp is low and the wind is coming through the boards. She works on him through the night, the way she worked on the ribs and the way she worked on Pete, only this time her hands are shaking. She stops them shaking by holding them flat against his chest for a count of 10 until the steadiness comes back, because steadiness is a thing you can call back if you've practiced it enough years. She sets the needles along the ribs and the hip. She packs the gash at the hip with the same paste she used on Pete. She binds him, and she keeps one hand on him the whole time so she can feel his breathing through her palm. Sometime before dawn, his breathing changes from the bad, shallow kind to the long, even kind, and she knows he's past the place where the dying was an option. She doesn't cry. She sits back on her heels in the straw and puts both hands over her face for a count of 10, and then takes them away, and that is the only sign that she was afraid, and it's the only sign she'll ever give him. When he wakes, the lamp is low and amber, and she is asleep beside him on the straw, with her hand still on his chest and the box open at her knee. He looks at the hand, then at the box, then at her face in the bad light, and he understands, without either of them saying it, that the marriage stopped being paper somewhere in the creek, and that neither of them is going to put it back. The storm breaks the next afternoon. They lose the south fence, and the one steer that was down in the pump, the one she fixed in the first week, is working again by evening because she fixed it again. The thing that was dying on the Ryder place wasn't only the ranch, and the thing that came back up out of the creek wasn't only a man. He woke in the back room, in her room, with the lamp low on the dresser and the box open beside it, the needles laid out in their grooves of red silk as if they'd always lived there. She'd moved them to the dresser the day before, and she hadn't asked, and he hadn't asked why she hadn't asked. The box had found its place in the ranch house. He looked at it in the morning light and understood that so had she. Moss came back 10 days later, with a sheriff this time, a young man from the county seat who'd ridden out more out of duty than conviction. Zane and Noriko met them on the porch together, the way they'd meet everything from then on, side by side. She had a receipt. He had the marriage paper signed by Horner. The sheriff read both, read the copy of the notary stamp from San Francisco, looked at Moss and told him to ride on and not come back with the same paper. Moss rode on. The law, this once, was on the side of the people who'd kept their records and kept their word. And Noriko watched him go down the drive and felt the leash on her quiet pride go slack for the first time since Cottonwood. That week she opened the front room. Ruth's things had stood untouched for 2 winters. The portrait on the wall, the shawl on the chair, the coffee tin on the shelf with the lid still on it. Noriko folded the shawl and wrapped the portrait in clean linen and set both in the trunk at the foot of the bed with the care she gave her grandmother's needles, and she left the coffee tin on the shelf because a house keeps one thing of a person who's gone, and that was the thing this house kept. Zane watched her do it from the doorway. He'd expected to feel the door close on something when the shawl went into the trunk. He felt it open instead. He didn't thank her. She would have been uncomfortable if he had. What he did, that evening, was pour 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her at the kitchen table and sit down across from her the way a man sits when he means to stay. She drank it while it was hot. He drank his. The lamp was lit on the sill, and neither of them thought to blow it out, but for the first time it was lit because they wanted the light, and not because they'd forgotten the dark. Weeks later, on an ordinary morning, with no storm and no rider and no paper to be read, Zane stood at the barn door and called her name across the yard. Noriko. She turned from the pump, the kimono under the trail coat, the knot of black hair catching the early light, and she came up the yard toward him, and it was the most ordinary thing in the world. That was the whole of it. Not a declaration, not a turning point he could name on a calendar. It was recognition, earned the way a bone knits when nobody's watching, in the weeks after the break, in the quiet work of 2 people who stopped pretending the rooms between them were walls. On the kitchen shelf the lacquered box sat beside Ruth's old coffee tin, 2 kinds of keeping side by side. The bargain had become the marriage long before either of them said so out loud, and the saying of it was the smallest part. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels.